Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tim Richter. I'm president of Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and thrilled to welcome you to our webinar today. We're going to be focusing on how frontline providers can support each other through grief while providing palliative approaches to care. We have a pretty straightforward agenda, so we're going to just have a really brief introduction. We've got about an hour for presentation, and then we have a question and answer period immediately following. I'd ask you in that question and answer period to use your Q&A tab, so everybody's muted. We've got a lot of folks on the line and become a bit chaotic if there's loads of folks speaking all at once. So if you have questions for the question and answer period at the end, please ask them in the Q&A tab. But I know that Daniel and others through the presentation are going to be chatting with you through the chat function. So be sure to locate that quickly on the control panel if you haven't already. Just to let you know, the webinar is going to be recorded and posted at on the Canadian Network for the Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness, the CNH3 website, at that link there. And you'll also find a load of other resources available to you to help you respond to COVID-19. So I won't introduce everyone. This is our very distinguished panel. I'm thrilled to have them all joining us from Toronto, and I will let them introduce themselves. I'm going to stop sharing now and pass the baton over. Let's see, stop my share and allow Sarah to put up her presentation, and I am going to disappear and turn it over to Naheed Bassani. Naheed, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining us. It is a real honor and privilege to be here today to speak on the topic that we'll be talking about, but do want to thank Tim and Debbie and the entire team of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness for their tireless advocacy and work, and to you all coast to coast as we have been in the midst of this life-changing, world-changing event, this pandemic. We are really excited to talk to you guys about COVID-19 and homelessness, how frontline providers can support the people we care for through grief while providing palliative approaches to care. What I do want to take a minute to do is just introduce everyone who is joining us today. I have the pleasure of working with this incredible team. Maybe we'll just go around and have everyone introduce themselves. Alyssa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, so my name is Alyssa Tedesco. I'm a palliative care physician with the Peach program in Toronto. I also practice addictions medicine. I'm also the outgoing chair of Health Providers Against Poverty, which is an advocacy organization based in Ontario.
Great. And Sarah?
Sorry, I was just figuring out how to unmute myself while sharing my screen. My name's Sarah. I'm a fifth-year psychiatry resident at the University of Toronto. I'll be graduating in just a couple of weeks. And for the past 6 months, I've had the pleasure of working with the Peach team as a consultant psychiatrist.
Great. And Jeff?
Hello, my name is Jeff McCarthy. I'm a family physician and a palliative care resident at University of Toronto. I worked with Peach during my residency.
Great. And Trevor?
Hey guys, I'm Trevor Morey. I'm one of the other palliative care residents in a family doc in Toronto as well, and have worked closely with the Peach team through my residency as well.
And Dan?
Thanks, Naheed. My name is Daniel Rosenbaum. I'm also a fifth-year psychiatry resident here in Toronto. And like Sarah, I spent some time doing consultative or collaborative care psychiatry work with the Peach team. Grateful to be here. Thanks.
Great, and I'm Naheed Bassani, and I'm one of the palliative care physicians with the Peach team, Palliative Education and Care for the Homeless, a mobile palliative care program in Toronto through Inner City Health Associates, and we'll be talking about that and so much more. Before I hand it off to Alyssa, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. Dan will be monitoring the chat box for any chat information, and as Tim mentioned, if you have any information to share, feel free to throw that in info into the chat. We will also be monitoring the Q&A section, which may be easier if you have questions, so we can actually monitor to make sure questions are being answered. And we have checkpoints in the presentation to be able to do all that. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Alyssa.
So thanks, Naheed. So we wanted to first frame the conversation that we are having today by acknowledging the land that we, the presenters, work and live on, being that of the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit Nation. As I'm sure all of you are aware, when we're talking about homelessness, we see disproportionate representation of Indigenous people within this population. When we're talking about grief, as we will today, we see a group of people who have experienced tremendous and innumerable traumas and continue to suffer from oppression in our society. So in addition to the homeless population being hit hard by COVID-19 in different ways, Indigenous peoples in Canada are also at much higher risk of contracting COVID-19 due to structural factors like poverty, lack of access to healthcare, and basic resources like adequate sanitation. So as a group, we'd like to acknowledge our responsibility to show solidarity with Indigenous peoples and work against their ongoing oppression. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we just wanted to draw attention to the Indigenous definition of homelessness, which is unlike the common colonialist definition of homelessness, in that it's not defined as, a lacking a structure of habitation, but rather is more fully described and understood through a composite lens of Indigenous worldviews, which include individuals, families, and communities which are isolated from their relationships to land, water, place, family, kin, each other, animals, cultures, languages, and identities.
Sorry, for today's presentation, we will be reviewing the following objectives. The first is to enhance our understanding of grief, moral distress, and trauma while being able to care for people experiencing homelessness during COVID-19. We know that the work that you do puts you on the front lines of dealing with people during challenging times, and then even more challenged by the pandemic. So providing strategies for coping with grief, recognizing the importance of advanced care planning and what the role of a substitute decision maker is, and then discussing resources and potential strategies to think about how we might be able to develop palliative approaches to care. And for some, palliative approaches to care may be a novel concept, and for others, depending on your jurisdiction, this may be part of your practice. But just re-emphasizing and re-censoring how palliative approaches to care can be helpful during this pandemic as well.
So I'm sure everyone in attendance here knows that homelessness was already a national emergency before COVID-19 hit. In Toronto, where we all work, we see an estimated of 10,000 people that are experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So then February, March came and COVID hit. Advocates, as I'm sure many of you did across the country, immediately raised the alarm, pleading for increased protections for people experiencing homelessness, including housing and resources to support their physical distancing, adequate sanitation, screening, PPE for frontline workers, and improved access to testing. Next slide. To no one's surprise, in Toronto especially, we have seen that despite these calls and actions towards better supporting people experiencing homelessness in the context of the pandemic, a lot of what we've seen is that not enough was done to prevent outbreaks in shelters. And in Toronto, we've seen quite a few, as well as a number of people experiencing homelessness who have tested positive for the virus. So many are left to sleep in conditions that they know put them at high risk for contracting COVID-19, or left to make a decision about sleeping on the streets or sleeping rough as a way to protect themselves and others and the people that they care about. So for those who work with the homeless population, as you all do, we all recognize that these clients, for a myriad of reasons, are at higher risk of contracting COVID-19 and sicker in general because of the adverse social determinants of health. And this is really, in many ways, as a result of structural vulnerability. And for those who might not be familiar with this concept, this term was coined by researchers in Victoria, BC, who actually focus on palliative care for structurally vulnerable people. But they define it as when location within social, economic, and political hierarchies, as well as power dynamics, limit agency and produce vulnerability to risk and harm among particular groups. So examples of, the homeless population would be an example of a structurally vulnerable group, but also it includes those experiencing poverty, disability, mental illness, people who use drugs, for example. And people who experience homelessness often experience multiple intersecting structural vulnerabilities like stigmatization, racism, colonialism, criminalization, physical violence. And so this definition is really meant to capture these populations clearly without attaching blame and really attributing their vulnerabilities that they experience in our society as a result of these upstream structural factors. And so this report, which I would recommend all of you read who care for people experiencing homelessness, is called Too Little Too Late by this research group that I mentioned. And it outlines the results of a large study that followed the experience of structurally vulnerable people as they navigated advanced illness. And it highlights that in general, the population that surrounds these individuals in the communities are worlds of how they describe as unmet needs, multiple losses, persistent grief, and vicarious trauma, which speaks to both the lack of support for these populations in many ways, but also the distress experienced by the workers who so compassionately care for them in the face of such significant loss and injustice. So we introduced this concept today because it really does impact how we ourselves cope as caring for people experiencing homelessness.
All right, so I think Dan was just actually cut off. So I'm just going to stand in his place. So we have a case here, part one, Jessica, who's a 33-year-old who works at a men's shelter in a downtown Canadian city. Despite being committed to her work and highly active in the community, she does participate in anti-poverty organizing. When the pandemic began, she quickly became upset by the lack of attention and inaction for people experiencing homelessness. She was frustrated by the calls for social or physical distancing, which obviously cannot be heeded in an overcrowded shelter. She was keenly aware of the risks facing the people she works with, many of whom have one or more chronic medical conditions. Many use substances daily, some smoke, and some live with severe mental illness. Some clients have left the shelter in recent days, preferring to sleep on the street rather than in the overcrowded and potentially dangerous shelter. And I can see from the comments that this is something that's resonating with people. Others she hasn't seen for some time, and she worries that she may have gotten sick. That they may have gotten sick and are in hospital or worse. She just learned about a client, Carlo, an older man with COPD who has other medical conditions for which he takes numerous pills daily, and who's been at the shelter since she started working there. Died this week in a hospital due to COVID-19 after a week-long stay in the intensive care unit. And as far as she knows, Carlo doesn't have any family members in Toronto. She and her coworkers were deeply affected by this news, angry about the potentially preventable infection that led to Carlo's death, and sad about the condition of his passing, alone and hooked up to so many machines to be kept alive. In the end, he did die. However, she and her colleagues do not stop to process or otherwise reflect on Carlo's passing or other emotions attached to it, concerned that they may have been with the safety of the other clients and aware that they need to support other people who are, in need of care due to inadequate action from the city. So just thinking about this case specifically, wondering through the comments, can you relate to this experience? How might this experience be different in your setting? What do you think is contributing to her grief? And if this story resonates with you at all, what is this bringing up for you? Feel free to chat away in the comments. Just noting, Delaney is saying, yes, we've seen a rise in youth on the streets since quarantine as well, due to unsafe living conditions, non-affirming parents or foster parents, and gendered violence. Thank you, Delaney. Marianne notes, very true. Very true. I don't believe enough was at the beginning in the shelters of this COVID-19 pandemic, so I don't believe there was enough supports in shelters. And Leticia is noting that this resonates huge. We're glad. Not glad that this is happening, but glad that this is resonating with you all.
And on that note, we're going to turn the presentation now to talk a little bit about grief, moral distress, and vicarious trauma, all of which are concepts that we feel are really important to how what frontline workers might be experiencing, and also how they might be coping with the current situation in the shelter system given COVID-19. So to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about the emotions of loss, which are in our culture encapsulated by this concept of grief. So grief is sort of an amorphous term that can refer to a lot of different things, but a really nice sort of straightforward definition is that grief refers to the pain of any sort that's experienced before, during, or after loss. And I really like this definition of grief because it acknowledges this sort of ongoing timeline that can occur with grief. It's not just that you lose something, like most classically understood as like losing someone important to you in your life, and then you have this like experience of emotion. Grief is really something that we can anticipate. So there's this idea of anticipatory grief, where as things are changing around us, we start to grieve for the things that we might lose or the things that we're worried about losing. And then as you're going through the process of loss, and for many people, dying is really a process. It's not just a moment in time, and people can be grieving, including the person who is dying, during the dying process, and then also afterwards. Obviously there's that period traditionally known as mourning, where we typically grieve as a community, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the barriers to that right now, later on in the presentation. Grief seems to be a really universal emotion. There's an experience of grief, though the words may not be the same across most cultures and places in the world. And it doesn't refer to any sort of singular emotion. So it's not just talking about sadness. You can have a variety of emotions that are associated with your grief. You can feel angry, you can feel sad, you can be irritable, frustrated. And that's part of, I think, what can make grief feel overwhelming sometimes, is that there's a lot of different things going on at once, and it can be a lot to process. And in our culture that doesn't typically like to talk about loss, we talk a lot about progress and overcoming and achievement. It can feel sometimes stigmatized to talk about your grief, and people don't necessarily express their grief in direct ways. Sometimes we don't even know that our emotions are connected to our sense of loss. And I think it's important to contextualize and frame grief as a sense of loss in general, because we don't just grieve people around us who we lose. It is entirely possible to grieve our way of life. It's possible to grieve things that you were looking forward to that you now can no longer do, and you can grieve abilities that you once had that you now no longer had. It really is just a term to refer to the emotions surrounding loss. And that's part of what makes grief, the experience of grief, a little unique during this time of COVID-19. So first of all, as a society, many of us are grieving right now. So some of us may have been touched by COVID-19 in the sense that we know someone who's died of the illness. We may be touched by it in that we know people who are dying of other illnesses that we're not able to be with in the same way that we would typically when they were dying. And there's a greater sense of isolation right now, and people are grieving their communities, their social lives, the things that they had all planned on doing that can now no longer do. So I think that there is a lot of grief around us. And yet, even though many of us are experiencing grief, our traditional ways of going through a mourning process or a grieving process have been disrupted, because as humans, we typically grieve in communities. It feels very natural and important to us to turn to each other in our grief, and we're not able to do that in the same way right now because of physical distancing practices. And it can feel sort of overwhelming to be grieving in isolation. We know Alyssa talked about this idea of structural vulnerability, and we know that people who either work in settings where they're witnessing a lot people with a lot of structural vulnerabilities or who have structural vulnerabilities are also uniquely vulnerable during the grieving process, because they may not have the same kind of supports or privilege or financial means to help manage their grief and their emotions. And so it sets people up for developing something like complicated grief, which is basically the inability to resolve a lot of the emotions around grief, and that can predispose people to more negative, adverse outcomes to their mental well-being.
So I can see some very insightful comments here by Ashley, Leticia, Candice, all really addressing the factors that contribute to the grief experienced by people caring for people experiencing homelessness. And it's really clear to us that, you know, the grief that we're experiencing is quite unique in the context of COVID-19 as a pandemic, but for the populations that we care for and in ourselves, we see that this grief can be compounded by vicarious trauma. So for those who might not have heard this terminology before, essentially vicarious trauma is the emotional response to listening and witnessing patients' narratives of traumatic events, which often provokes intense emotions, including profound sadness, helplessness, frustration, and anger. So essentially, it describes the experience and reaction of witnessing the gross injustice experienced by many of our clients. And in the midst of COVID-19, you know, this is the injustice of not seeing, you know, governments work quickly enough to protect the clients that we care so much about. So we see vicarious trauma experienced by frontline workers in the homeless sector because they are in constant view of structural violence, which is defined as a way of describing the social factors that put individuals and populations in harm's way. So these arrangements are structural because they're essentially embedded in the political and economic organization of our social world, and they're violent because they cause harm and injury to people. I think we missed us. Oh, go ahead.
To move ahead with our case then, it's been a week now after the death of the client that Jessica was working closely with, Carlo. And as the situation with the pandemic has evolved, more and more clients are being admitted to hospital. And Jessica, our frontline worker, is starting to notice that things are becoming more difficult for her in the workplace. She's feeling very stressed, very irritable, and has lots of worries about herself as well. And she is also hearing more and more from clients, understandably, about their worries regarding illness or potentially serious illness. And there comes a time when Jessica realizes that part of what she might be experiencing is grief related to these losses.
So in addition to the day-to-day work of people in the homeless sector already causing a toll, and you know, in the case of having to witness, you know, injustice in terms of poverty, of lack of affordable housing, of, you know, systemic racism, of colonialism, we see that in the midst of COVID-19, you know, clients may be dying more. And this study isn't specific to COVID-19, but it talks about the toll that, you know, the death of clients takes on people who work in the homeless sector, and the ways by which some of these workers have found strategies to cope with those deaths. And so this study was done in 2011 in Dublin by Richard Lakeman. So in terms of how the homeless sector workers there described how they cope with the death of their clients, many talked about how they marked death or how they did small things personally in order to, you know, celebrate that person's life. So it might be lighting a candle, spending a few moments in quiet reflection at some point during their day. Other people talked about how they appreciated when their vulnerability was recognized, whether that was through a kind word, an inquiry into how they were doing, permission to leave work early, or just an invitation even to talk about how they were feeling. Some people found that formal processes to assist them in learning and kind of making sense of what happened and deal with the emotional impact was helpful, but a lot of people didn't have access to these formal processes. And a lot of people, even if they did have access, felt concern that they might be seen as weak or unprofessional, which I think kind of speaks to the stigmatization of grief that Sarah mentioned earlier in the presentation. A number of people talked about self-care strategies that they had, but I think a big piece that I think a lot of us can probably resonate with is, what they did to recognize their successes and to, in some ways find a way to positively frame that person's death. So the author had said the traumatic and seemingly senseless deaths of some service users pose challenges to positively framing the person's death, making sense of their life in homeless sector work. When confronted by particularly traumatic experiences, a positive frame may involve a renewed commitment to justice, advocacy, or work in general so as to give meaning and significance to a person's death. So we'll talk a little bit more about, coping strategies, but sometimes engaging in that advocacy work and feeling like you're doing something on those higher levels that seem to frustrate us so much in our day-to-day can be a means of helping to cope and make sense of, your client's deaths.
So I'm going to move now into talking a little bit more about coping strategies. But before I do, I wanted to introduce this concept of moral distress that Alyssa has sort of alluded to, and that I think is really relevant to understanding how to cope and why we may be feeling some of the ways that we feel right now as frontline workers working with people experiencing homelessness. So moral distress is a concept that emerged actually out of the nursing literature, and it refers to the way that people feel, or the distress that people feel when they are put in a situation where they know what the right thing, what the moral thing feels for them to do, but they're prevented from taking this course of action by institutional or societal or some sort of external constraint. So an example of this now might be in the shelter system. We know that physical distancing is required, and we understand sort of what the parameters around physical distancing are, but based on the particular physical layout of where one is working or something like that, they're noticing that they can't physically distance people in the same way, or that people aren't able to abide by physical distancing. And there can be a sense of frustration that emerges from that, which is that I know what I want to do, I know what I have to do to keep these people I care about safe, and I'm simply unable to do that because of something external to myself. And that sort of distress can also be compounded and can compound and can be compounded by also a sense of grief. So I think there's a lot of different things going on for frontline workers now working with this particular population that could be causing distress. So one of the things that people might feel moral distress about is that they notice that their clients themselves are grieving or might be experiencing grief and not really wanting to help and not really knowing what to do about it. So we have some suggestions around how you can support clients who are grieving right now, either the loss of someone or losses in their own lives. The number one thing that we would recommend is that to approach the situation from a place of humanity, being genuine, being authentic. You could, even if you're comfortable, share your own experiences of feeling sadness at this time, not necessarily going into personal details, but sort of saying that the emotions sort of resonate with you. And when you do that, that can actually be quite validating for people, which is the first point on this slide. Validation is a great tool to help support clients who are grieving. And what we mean by validation is using skills and patterns of communication that make people truly feel heard, you really understand what they're trying to communicate and what they're going through. So tips for validation can be things like, again, sharing in the emotion, providing sort of summarizing statements about what the person is saying to you so they know that you're really listening. You can also make some guesses as to how people are feeling. So for example, if a client comes to you crying, you can say, I see you're crying. It seems like you're pretty sad right now. Do you have something that you want to talk about? And really sort of showing the clients through those subtle validation skills that you're there for them. You're you're willing to sit quietly and listen. You're not necessarily offering up solutions or advice because there may actually be none to give. But having someone to sit with an emotion can be an extremely powerful experience. Another way to support clients who are grieving is to help give them a sense of control over the situation. So grief, like we talked about, can feel very overwhelming, and sometimes people can feel powerless in the face of their grief, like there's nothing they could have done to prevent the loss, or that they feel like forces outside of themselves are shaping their lives. And though we never will be able to give people like full control over what's going on, I think all of us are feeling a loss of control. Sometimes finding small moments of control within this sense of powerlessness can be really helpful. And later on in the presentation, Trevor, Jeff, and Nahid are going to go through actually some planning strategies that you can use to help give your clients a little bit of control, at least over their wishes and what they would like for quality of life. It's also very important for us to acknowledge when we might be grieving and support ourselves and support each other in that grief. Because I think many of us, and myself very much included, are being confronted with a sense of grief right now, both over things that we may have lost in our own lives, as well as sadness or frustration or anger we might have within the systems in which we work because of that moral distress, because we wish we could do more to help people in a way that feels right to us, and we're prevented from doing that in some, like, oftentimes for really reasonable reasons, but it can still feel quite frustrating. And I think it's really important for us to name our grief and to acknowledge it and have compassion for ourselves in that. So not feel angry if we're feeling down one day, not feeling frustrated or getting down on ourselves if we feel like we can't quite do our work with the same gusto as we used to. These are really highly abnormal times, and this is a very normal, like, having these feelings of grief is a very normal reaction to that time. So reminding ourselves and being compassionate towards ourselves with that in mind when we're feeling our grief. As Alyssa mentioned in that study, self-care is also very important to helping with feelings of grief. So maintaining as best a sleep schedule as you can, maintaining your connections outside of work so that you have something to distract yourself from perhaps some of the things that you're seeing in your workplace, and maintaining your own social connections so that you yourself feel supported. There are different kinds of mindfulness strategies and relaxation techniques such as deep breathing that can help at least momentarily relieve some of the distress. And we also wanted to highlight it's really important to ask for help if you feel like you're having emotions or distress that is difficult to cope with. I know I'm more familiar with some of the resources more locally for me, but I think across the country, there are different organizations offering resources to frontline workers. And I would encourage you, because I can see that there's people from all over the country, to share any resources you may have found particularly helpful in the chat box, because in the spirit of supporting one another, there's probably other people on the line who would be appreciative of any resources you might have. And that sort of speaks to the next point about supporting our colleagues who are grieving. We talked about how grief is usually a collective, or the mourning process is usually collective. And I think we do have some opportunities in our workplace to at least be in the spirit of that, and that can be quite supportive. So we would really encourage any of the workplaces or people who represent the administrative powers within different workplaces to provide safe spaces and time for workers to express their distress if they're comfortable, making sure that they're feeling supported in that. Even naming to individuals that they may be experiencing distress, and even naming the moral distress, because sometimes if we're struggling alone with feeling like there's a right thing to do but we can't do it, sometimes naming it and having someone else say, yeah, I feel the same way, can be very validating, and it can help people share the burden of that distress instead of individuals taking it on in a way that feels overpowering. And we would encourage workplaces to also have resources available to their frontline workers where they can go to ask for help to help support their mental well-being. And actually, our group has created resources that are available online. They're at the link highlighted at the bottom of the screen. for frontline workers that actually summarizes a lot of the presentation today and has a list of resources that are available on the web. Some are American, some are Canadian resources that can help with mental well-being during times of COVID-19 and the grief that people can be experiencing.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And as a form of actually supporting grief within our community, we have taken steps as a team to formally recognize what goes on when we care for people, and we call these sessions debriefing sessions or debriefing circles that we have through the Peach team. Anytime someone, one of our clients passes away, we descend on the site that this client may have received care. It could be a respite, a drop-in, or a shelter, or a housing agency, and we support each other through grief and resilience in the building of community. We gather in a circle, we light a flame, and we take time, often a half hour to an hour, to reflect on the person that we cared for, moving through 4 R's. The first is to remember the person we cared for. Then we talk about what it was like to care for them and reflect on those processes and what that meant. Recover, and then work towards recovering and reinvesting in the future so that we can go out there and do it again, because we undoubtedly will. For those who are interested in learning more about our debriefing circles through the Peach program, this was covered on the CBC radio show White Coat Black Art, and the screenshot of the link is there in the slides as well for you. So just moving on to the next slide, we are going to leave tons of time for questions at the end. So we're moving to the second half of this talk, where we're moving more into the part where we're talking about palliative approaches to care and the importance of advanced care planning. And as we move to the next slide, I think it goes without saying that, just if you can back up to the last slide. That goes without saying that people experiencing homelessness are very sick. This is one of Canada's sickest subpopulations. 3/4 of them have one or more chronic diseases. They're 28 times more likely to have hepatitis C, 5 times more likely to have heart disease, 4 times more likely to have cancer. When they get sick, they're much more likely to present to the hospital, such as the emergency department, and are much more likely to be admitted to hospitals compared to you or I. And one of the fastest growing subsets of the homeless population in North America, Europe, and Australia are people experiencing increased frailty, or the elderly, people who are over the age of 55, many of which are new to the streets and experiencing homelessness. And so we're more than ever, homeless service providers, people working in the sector, are having to become more comfortable with supporting people who are older, more frail, and sicker than ever before in our communities. As we move to the next slide, when we think about the end-of-life experiences of people who experience homelessness, and keeping in mind that not all of palliative care is about end-of-life care, but some of it does have to do with end-of-life care, in that life expectancies for people experiencing homelessness in this country are very short. The average life expectancy for someone who's homeless in Canada is 34 to 47 years old. They die at a rate that's 2.3 to 4 times higher than the average Canadian baseline population. And in comparison, people who are housed in Canada live an average age of 77 to 82 years. When surveyed, most Canadians with homes want to die at home if given the opportunity. We find that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness also want to die at home. Just what they call home is structurally incongruent with the way that we deliver healthcare in our communities, and so the vast majority of them die in emergency departments or hospitals, not where they want to be. And some die in transitional spaces like, you know, parks or other spaces that are more public, and very few die in what many people that we care for call home. And that's again due to the incongruence in our program delivery models, which do not allow us to deliver palliative care for people experiencing homelessness. So, you know, the data is in. Homelessness is like a serious illness. It is like a life-limiting illness. In fact, research shows that it cuts a person's lifespan by half. And really, the next slide brings it home. It's that simple, 50%. Homelessness cuts a person's lifespan by 50%. And so it got us thinking about 5 to 6 years ago, isn't homelessness a terminal diagnosis? Is it not a palliative care diagnosis of the social determinants of health? And while that's not an endpoint we want to leave you at, and it is somewhat of a doom and a gloom concept, it's not meant to be. We know that colleagues at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Tim and others and you in your various jurisdictions are doing what you can to end homelessness. But we as health providers have that contribution to make to this discourse, and have seen how not having a home can cut person's lifespan by upwards of half. We just transition now to thinking about palliative care and how palliative care is viewed in our communities. This is a way of thinking of palliative care that we recognize is somewhat old school. This is how we used to think of palliative care, that people had curative treatments, they had a diagnosis, and then they received palliative care, and then they died. As we move to the next model, which over the last few years has been the model that more of us are using, we recognize that as people's curative treatments decrease over time, their palliative care treatments may increase, which include in treatments around quality of life, pain, symptoms, emotional supports, and so on. And then finally, we move to what is considered the future of palliative care, which is the bow tie model of palliative care. The idea that palliative care is an approach to care which can help people who may be receiving curative treatments, and maybe helping people who are in remission of their disease, and maybe even helping people who survive their disease. And it may also be helpful for people at end of life. And many of the clients we care for are on this bow tie model and moving across it and are all around it all the time, and recognizes the true value of palliative care. Palliative care is a lot of things. It's an approach to care, and it's a philosophy of care, which emphasizes quality of life for people with serious illnesses. It is a way to alleviate whole person suffering. Yes, there is a medical part of palliative care that aims to address pain and symptom management through the use of medicines, for example, but it's also about spiritual well-being and quality of life well-being. Sometimes palliative care is described as a way of giving up, and that's not true. Palliative care is actually active treatment. It is an active form of care, and it is active specialty within healthcare. One of the cool things about palliative care is it's not just about the person that we care for. It's about the client and their caregivers, which can include the street family, but also can include many of the people who are here with us today, as you are part of those circles of care. And that's why these talks are important. That's why these discussions are vital. Palliative care is not just for end of life. It is for any person at any stage of disease, and is often thought to be best provided when thought of right away when people are diagnosed. We often hear of people talking about the palliative care floor in a hospital, and yes, palliative care can be a place, but it is more of a philosophy of care that can be provided at any setting, in a shelter, in a clinic, in an emergency department, in a hospital. And it's a tool to help us to think about the future, and that's a big part of palliative care. And for that, I'll hand it off to Jeff and Trevor to speak more. So before we move on to that next section about advanced care planning and planning for the future, this is a shot of our Peach team here in Toronto, and we do tend to take goofy, fun photos like this. The Peach team is a palliative care team that was founded in Toronto in 2014 that provides palliative care and quality of life supports to people experiencing homelessness and respite shelters and drop-ins. What started as a team of a doctor and nurse driving around has now grown to a team of peers, care coordinators, nurses, allied health professionals, physicians, working to support people with their quality of life needs wherever they're at physically, on the street, under a bridge, in a shelter, but also wherever they're at along the trajectory of their illness. But the Peach team is not in isolation. As we move to the next slide, we are very proud to be a part of a national and international community. Two of our cousin and sister programs are featured on the slide. In Calgary, we have the Calgary Allied Mobile Palliative Program, which is led by Dan Glover and Simon Colgan and colleagues through the CUPS program. And also, in Victoria, the PORT program, this is a photo of Dr. Fraser Black, a palliative care physician doing outreach visits with colleagues who have started that program in Victoria, British Columbia, with colleagues like Dr. Kelly Stadshahar as well. And we're proud to be part of a national and international community that is recognizing palliative approaches to care are important, and that they're also an important pathway to housing for people. And so sometimes there is this misnomer that palliative care is a luxury and sort of seen as bells and whistles, but actually it has been seen as a useful adjunct to get people to end their homelessness trajectories as well. Trevor and Jeff, take it away.
Yeah. So if we think about COVID-19 as a serious illness, and for clients experiencing homelessness, we already spoke about how clients experiencing homelessness are at an increased risk of infection for a variety of reasons, including barriers to social distancing, access to protective equipment, and testing. We also know that because clients experiencing homelessness tend to have higher rates of serious illnesses and lower life expectancy, that in the setting of a healthcare resource scarcity, for example, intensive care unit beds and ventilators, that clients with underlying serious illness may not be offered those limited resources if they become ill from COVID-19 because of low survival rates. And the important thing is that all clients be offered palliative care. A key principle in palliative care is non-abandonment. And I think a quote that really illustrates this well comes from an article in the CMAJ called Pandemic Palliative Care Beyond Ventilators and Saving Lives, where they say, for those who are denied access to critical care, they have a right to expect high quality palliative care in place of ventilator. Failing to deliver palliative care in this context would compound the tragedy of the pandemic and would arguably be a more substantial failure of the healthcare system.
To move our case along then, some more time has passed since Jessica made that crucial recognition of her emotional reaction to Carlo's death. And she has had a chance to engage in some of the debriefing sessions, something like what Naheed mentioned. And she's begun to reflect on what kinds of things she might have done differently, having gone through this experience. And that's led her to think about how she can work with people to support their planning ahead as much as can be reasonably expected in these uncertain times. And in addition, she's also developed a daily routine. She's sleeping more regularly. She's connecting with her friends and loved ones on a regular basis. And all of this is serving to bolster her ability to cope and to continue to provide the kind of care she's used to providing to the people she works with.
So we've already spoken about anticipatory grief, the sense of forthcoming loss, and also clients worry about how their loved ones will cope after they've died. This is further compounded by a collective anticipatory grief where whole communities can feel this. So when will people I care about be affected, and when will the spread reach my community? And we spoke about how advanced care planning can help restore that sense of control for both the client and their care providers. So we're going to get a little bit into what advanced care planning is about in the conversation. So the next two slides deal with specific language about how to bring up these conversations. And it's not a formulaic way of having these conversations. It's more about finding a technique that works for you. So we'll read these two aloud and then take pieces from each to see what fits most naturally for you. So the first comes from Speak Up Ontario. There is a lot of fear and uncertainty now in the COVID-19 pandemic, and the situation is changing quickly in Ontario. I wish we weren't in this situation, but I worry what might happen if you got sick with COVID-19 or your other health problems were to worsen. I wonder if we can talk about this. And the second comes from Respecting Choices. During so much uncertainty amid the COVID-19 pandemic, one thing you can control is who you ask to speak for you if you can't speak for yourself. We help individuals and their healthcare agents and families talk about and plan for their care before a medical crisis occurs. We want to know your values and preferences, which will help us understand what matters most to you should you become ill due to complications from COVID-19. So, sorry, I think there might be a slide before that. We talk about what is advanced care planning. So it's an ongoing conversation that is future oriented. So it holds two things in balance. We balance hope for the best while planning and preparing for the worst should it arise. So there's two goals that are that we want to reach for in having these conversations. One is to empower clients to name a trusted person as their substitute decision maker, and we'll define that in a moment. The second is to help clients to reflect and express their values and wishes for care. And benefits of these conversations include an increased focus on comfort, decreased hospitalizations, and increased referrals to palliative care, which is shown in the literature. So speaking about that first goal, naming a substitute decision maker, the key question is, who will speak for my client's healthcare wishes if they can't do so themselves? And that's their SDM. So it's important to know that every person has an SDM. whether they know it or not. And what you'll see on the left is a hierarchy in the province of Ontario. It looks a little bit different for each province and territory. But a key theme is that it generally privileges biological family and healthcare decision-making, which you'll see noted in what roles are given the privilege of being an automatic subject decision maker. And then we'll speak about how clients can name a different trusted person or a friend, for example, as their SDM. In Ontario, this would be the attorney for personal care, which we'll touch on in a moment. So in terms of, so clients are can be empowered to choose a trusted person as their SDM. So it's helpful to think about who that person they might want them to be. So the key question is there a person you would trust to help the medical team make decisions for you if your health condition got worse? So ideally, this is someone that the client trusts, who knows them as a person and understands their wishes. And it's important to know that just because a person may be an SDM does not mean that they have the power to make those decisions. It happens at specific times, specifically when clients cannot speak for themselves about their wishes. And when an SDM is asked to speak for the client's wishes, they should approach it based on the client's prior known wishes, if known and possible, and if they're not known or not possible, based on the client's best interests. And in terms of the SDM, the hierarchies look a little bit different, the resources a little bit different in each province. I'd advise you to go to advancedcareplanning.ca, which has a by province recommendations. So let's say that we had a client that does know the trusted person they want to name their SDM. How do we help them do that? So in each province, this title has a slightly different name. In Ontario, as I mentioned, it's called the Power of Attorney for Personal Care. Different provinces call it a representative or an agent or a proxy or a subject decision maker in Newfoundland. As frontline workers, you can complete those forms with your client, and you'll see a picture of the POA for personal care form in Ontario. It does not require a lawyer to do this. It's important to note too that in most jurisdictions, a client can name one person to be their power of attorney for personal care to make medical decisions, and can name a different person who would be responsible for their property or finances. It can be the same person, but it can also be two different people. And then there's a link there for the form in Ontario. So we talked about these conversations, introducing them. We know that these conversations are rarely completed, if at all, for clients experiencing homelessness. And some barriers that come through in the literature include clients' frequent experiences with death, or the sense of a normalization of death, a survival focus, or the survival imperative, a mistrust of healthcare systems and providers, a belief that wishes will not be respected and care will be poor at the end of life. With respect to specific fears that clients experiencing homelessness may have, literature suggests fear of dying alone, anonymously, and worries about bodily remains, as well as a lack of SDM and advocates for them. So there's tools existing to help frontline workers having these conversations with clients, and we'll go through one later in the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. As Jeff had mentioned, there's a lot of barriers to advanced care planning for people experiencing homelessness and experiencing structural vulnerability. And so as part of the Peach team, we got together and created a resource for frontline workers to help have these advanced care planning conversations and highlight some questions that are important information for us to gather, and I think leverage the trust that our clients have in us to give us this information and help the healthcare teams as people develop more serious illness. So to highlight some of these sections of the document, we'll go to the next slide. So the first section of the document looks at illness understanding, and really part of what we're trying to gather is an understanding of where somebody is at, and where somebody's at and what they understand about their current health situation and how it would apply to our current COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this really helps us get on the same page as where our clients are at, and kind of be able to fill in the gaps or contact their healthcare providers to help give them more information as they would like to hear it. The second section, I think, is important and highlights a lot of the things that Jeff had mentioned earlier around who are the trusted people in somebody's circle. And we know for a lot of our clients, that it's often not biological family who are automatically assigned these roles, but more friends and trusted people within someone's lived experience within the shelter system, or at drop-ins, and friends that they trust or have gone through serious illness experiences with before. And these are often the people that, from my personal experience, have been assigned as substitute decision makers for some of my clients. And I think another thing that this part of the document highlights is the cultural and spiritual concerns that a lot of our clients, that may go unrecognized if our clients were to end up in a hospital setting. And then the next section of the document focuses on quality of life. And I think this is really where the palliative approach to care focuses in. This is really what our goal is to try to maximize the activities that someone is currently enjoying doing to the best of their ability with their advanced illness. And so some questions like, what are you enjoying throughout the day? And are there things that you would like to do with the time that you have remaining, that we may be able to help them perform? And I think these are where we can leverage kind of the trusting relationships that we have with clients to get this information to help modify their care plans. And then the next section is about setting and treatment decisions. So where somebody would like to receive their care, if they are very close to end of life, where would that setting be? These conversations are often very medicalized, and so certainly if as frontline workers you don't feel comfortable having those conversations, I think that's okay. I think for some people, as Jeff had mentioned, some of the barriers are that there's a mistrust of healthcare institutions, and so these conversations may be ones that people want to have but don't necessarily trust the people who are reaching out to them. And I think that we're well positioned to be able to have these conversations and to take to respect the people's wishes as they express them to us. And then I think another question is whether or not they feel comfortable talking to another healthcare provider about these in a more medical way. And so the last section of our document talks about legacy building and how we're going to remember people after they have passed away. And I think this is an important component of not only the experience of our clients, but for us as well as frontline workers who get to be really involved with some of our clients, and how we can best honor them as people and their lives and the things that they've cared about throughout their lives as well. And I think that, as Jeff had mentioned, some literature previously has shown that many people are concerned about what will happen to their remains when they pass away. And these are often things that are not talked about before someone has reached end of life. And I think these are important things that we could, important conversations that we can have as these illnesses progress. Another thing that we can focus on is what people may want to do with their possessions. So some people may have some personal possessions that they have or have been keeping at a shelter. Some people may have pets or people or animals that are close to them as well. And I think those are important things that we can address as well. One thing I just wanted to highlight is some other resources, and some resources where we've taken some of the development of the tool from, and it's the Homeless Palliative Care Toolkit that was developed by teams in the UK. St. Mungo's, which is an organization aiming to end homelessness in the UK, similar to the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness here, as well as Pathway, which is a healthcare organization for people experiencing homelessness, and the Mary Curie Palliative Care Association in the UK. And another I see in the chat that someone has mentioned the Speak Up Ontario kit, which has a lot of information around communication tools for people at end of life. And that's certainly for our clients in Ontario, a resource that we certainly use all the time as well. And so this toolkit that they've developed in the UK helps us identify clients to support palliative approaches to care and end-of-life care in shelter and settings for people experiencing homelessness, as well as some of the communication tools that they use in the UK specifically for people experiencing homelessness, as well as some bereavement supports and self-care.
Thanks, Trevor. And coming to the end of our presentation here, we'll conclude our case. And we are happy to report that our caseworker, Jessica, has found these conversations meaningful. She's been able to engage in advanced care planning conversations with her clients. She's helped people name and identify their values, as well as in some cases appoint a power of attorney for personal care and a substitute decision maker. And she's really found that through these conversations, she's deepened her rapport with people, as well as her understanding of what matters to them. And so with that, we'll come to the end of the presentation. And in conclusion, we'll highlight again that grief is absolutely a normative human response to loss. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, grief in this time can be considered a normal response to highly abnormal situations. Of course, the unique aspects of grief during the pandemic make us susceptible to complicated grief, or grief that might be associated with difficulty with resolution, or that can lead to burnout or depression or clinically significant anxiety. And one of the ways we suggest to mitigate this potentially complicated grief is through planning as best we can. And a powerful way to do that with clients is to engage in these advanced care planning conversations. Finally, again, we'll make sure these tools are shared, but we hope that the worksheets that we've developed can be helpful for people. And we've already heard from some people in the chat that that's been the case so far. And on that note, actually, we welcome any feedback people might have about the tools. And if there's room for improvement, we would certainly like to hear from you. And so we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you so much for attending and for your participation. I see one question here that I'll put to the panel regarding the legal limitations of powers of attorney for substitute decision makers, and specifically the role about a worker and how they might fit into the power of attorney consideration.
I can speak to that, and then maybe Jeff can add because he did that part of the presentation. So this is Alyssa. So unfortunately, like what we do see is that oftentimes, you know, their caseworker or, you know, their housing worker for people experiencing homelessness might be their most trusted person, and they might not have any biological family or be estranged from it. And unfortunately, at least in Ontario, which is the only experience that I can speak to, workers aren't allowed to be that power of attorney that's assigned. But what we're saying by asking you to, you know, potentially use this document to guide you, this is in no way a legal document, but it's just a way to facilitate the conversation and to guide you through it and to maybe jot down some helpful notes. In some circumstances, if somebody doesn't have a trusted person, whether that be somebody by hierarchy or, you know, not even having someone that they want to assign, in Ontario, it would go to like the public guardian and trustee, so someone who doesn't really know them at all. So having this information documented somewhere or having somebody who's had a conversation with them can be really helpful. And what you can do as, you know, a worker who might be involved in their care, who might have helped to facilitate some of this conversation, is to just integrate yourself as part of their healthcare team. So it's not done as much as it should, but I think a lot of us in Peach recognize how valuable your roles is and how well you know the clients. So to be involved in those healthcare decision-making planning as much as possible, to speak to what you know about the person, can actually really impact how care is provided and how decisions are made. It can be very guiding, although it can't, you know, be legally abided by. And we're talking about power of attorney and substitute decision maker, whatever it's called in your province, in the instance that they can't make decisions for themselves. So of course, while they're able to, they're making their own, but, you know, this is if they, you know, wouldn't have a voice to express their own preferences. Let us know if that doesn't answer your question.
Thanks, Alyssa.
I just see a question in the Q&A as well, Dan.
Oh, sorry, I haven't been paying attention to the Q&A.
It's from Delaney there.
Okay, thank you for the question, Delaney. I will summarize here. A lot of clients that Delaney, who shared the question, has had the honor of supporting are Indigenous youth or youth who are racialized, or people who are from the LGBTQ community and who may use substances or who have lived experiences in foster care and homelessness and so on. And because of the structural violence they've seen and experienced in their lifetimes, many youth and youth workers are burnt out. So what suggestions might the panel have for building resilience and solidarity together while maintaining long-term energy to question. Thank you for sharing it.
I can speak a little bit to that, but others on the panel feel free to jump in, because I know this is something that we as a group have been talking a lot about over the past couple of weeks as we spent time developing this tool, and I think have been, at least in some of the work we collectively do, trying to support each other. I think as you highlight, the risk of burnout in these situations can be higher because, and I'm just getting a chance to catch up on the chat now because I was doing the screen share, because like people are experiencing a lot of moral distress and potentially feeling very frustrated by things that are out of control and more in the control of governments or other groups that don't like have a visceral experience of what our clients are going through on a daily basis, the way that people who are on the front lines and bearing witness to it might. And I think that's where, and I think the question even like commented on this, where acting as a collective is really important, because I think what makes people, one of the things that makes people really high risk for burnout in these situations is taking on like a lot of responsibility onto an individual's shoulders. And right now we're really seeing the importance of collective action and working together as a team where we can share that responsibility, we can support each other, and where we can have the space to just validate one another in terms of being like, yes, this is a really frustrating situation and this feels like too much. And I think once there is that shared understanding, it also becomes perhaps a little bit easier or a little less stigmatizing to ask for help and saying like, hey, like today's a day when I just really can't handle this one thing. Do you mind helping me out, and fostering that spirit of collegiality? Because if we feel like we're in a situation together and we have people who can back us up, then it becomes a little less of like something that we're individually carrying and something that we can all like weather together as a community. And I think community is so important in these kinds of situations, and part of what makes COVID-19 really unique is that the way that we understand community in many of our cultures is disrupted, because we understand communities coming together, and that's not something that we can do right now. So hopefully the workplaces that people are in can also find structures within that workplace to foster community in a more physically distanced kind of way.
So feel free to jump in with more questions or comments. I know we have a bit of time. I think Dan asked a really good question in the comment box that I'll actually ask our panel here. What have been the most frustrating or challenging aspects of providing care for clients, particularly during this pandemic, as it pertains to loss, grief, palliative care approaches? What have been your experiences, guys?
So I can speak to, I've been working mainly in the hospital over the last couple of months with the pandemic ramping up, and I've had a few patients, clients who've come in who've experienced homelessness or were couch surfing with their friends, and have developed illness, advanced illness, specifically more around cancers and things like that, and not necessarily COVID-19, but people who have advanced illness. I think there's a hesitancy to come to hospital or to seek health services out of fear of contracting COVID-19. And this client came in to the hospital, wasn't able to kind of express their own wishes to the healthcare team, and it took a little bit of digging, but we were able to connect with the friend who he had been couch surfing with, who's known him for 5 years, and kind of had actually had some of these advanced care, you know, in a non-medical way, advanced care planning conversations with him. But unfortunately, because he hadn't been assigned as a power of attorney for personal care, he wasn't able to formally be involved with the care team, and so the case went to the PG&T, the public guardian and trustee, and they worked with the medical team to help make those decisions. But certainly, I think there was some moral distress on the part of this client's friend, not being able to be, not being able to physically visit in the hospital due to visitor restrictions that a lot of our hospitals have right now. And I think that was certainly something that was difficult for this client's friends and family, street family. And I think that not having someone who really knows this client be able to advocate for them in the hospital was also something that was really difficult. But fortunately, we were able to connect with previous care team members and get them out of hospital in a meaningful way and get supported in the community. But that's certainly been something that I've noticed even over the last few months. It's hard at baseline, but has been certainly compounded by COVID-19 for sure.
Thanks, Trevor. Any other challenging cases or concepts for people during this time?
Yeah, I've been, like, in the work that I do with the Peach team, something I've been really struck by over the past couple of weeks is that at baseline, a lot of our clients feel very isolated. And now that there's the physical distancing measures in place, people are feeling even more isolated. So I know some of the moments that have been hardest for me is when I can finally get someone on a phone, which can be challenging with some of the people that we work with, and they say things like, I just want someone who can hold my hand. I just want someone who can give me a hug. And really that longing for physical proximity and physical comfort that I just know there's no way that I'm able to provide right now. And especially for some of our folks, and we didn't really touch on this as much in the presentation, but for our folks who may be coming to end of life for a whole variety of other reasons, to then not be able to have their community or their loved ones around them at end of life the way that they might have hoped. I know that for me, those are some of the most difficult moments, and trying to find ways to provide comfort in other ways. So I might call them a little bit more than I otherwise usually might. We might have just a chat. It's a very non-medicalized conversation, just because I feel like that's the way that I can provide some humanity and some comfort to them when I can't physically be present.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm not seeing any other comments or questions coming through. So what we'll do to round out this discussion, if it's okay with you guys, is just quick, final nuggets, 30 seconds. We're gonna go across the panel. Any final words of wisdom, maybe one tip, one thought you have around supporting people with loss and grief or palliative approaches to care through advanced care planning. We will start with Alyssa.
Hi. So I think, I mean, my piece ties into the last question. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic being very fearful about COVID-19 hitting, our clients hard and the homeless population in our city very hard. And I felt a reluctance to want to engage in these conversations about, what would happen if they got sick, what would happen if they were dying, because of a lot of that frustration and that moral distress that this shouldn't be the case. But I think in general, having these conversations is really a way to empower our clients in a way that they have not been able to be empowered for, large portions of their life. And, outside of the pandemic, it's still really important to have their wishes respected. And we've seen too many cases of, people having a trusted person that was never formally assigned to be their power of attorney, or somebody who had very clear wishes, but they were never documented. So, outside of the pandemic and moving forward, this is still something that really important that we can do to empower our clients and ensure they get, the legacy that they wanted.
Fabulous. Jeff?
Yeah, I would just echo about advanced care planning that, it's built on a foundation of rapport. So in a lot of ways, as frontline workers, you're in an excellent position to have these conversations and just to reach out for help if you need it from the your local medical resources, palliative care teams that you work with.
Great. Trevor?
Yeah, I think to echo all of that, with the worksheet, where we developed the worksheet based on these the Homeless Palliative Care Toolkit developed in the UK. And if anybody has any feedback for us about exactly what questions we've put in, or any other questions that maybe were missed that people feel would be important, feel free to give us feedback around that, because we'd be happy to accept that, because I know that our experience is different and we're very used to having these conversations as a medical team, but there's certainly potentially new conversations for you guys. So I definitely appreciate that. I also want to put in a plug for advocacy as well. I know that some members of the group here have been advocating for policy change and changes to with our local governments and things like that. So if you guys have communities outside of your organizations that you can organize with or help to make some changes within the system, I would definitely support you guys on that, and feel free to reach out to us if you want to further do that.
Thanks, Trevor. Sarah?
Yeah, I think I just want to emphasize that all emotions that people might be feeling right now are really valid, they're really important, and that they're also really normal. This is like this really weird, extremely stressful time. And so like ask for help, be kind to yourself. You don't need to be operating at your absolute best right now. That's completely understandable. And thank you all for the work that you do.
And Dan?
If I can try to tie together or make a tangential comment about something Jeff said and something that Trevor said. Jeff's point about asking for help applies not only to situations with clients that might fall out of our area of expertise, but I think also in terms of asking for help from colleagues. And so tying into the point that Trevor made about advocacy, one of the most powerful components of advocacy work is the fact that it's done together, collectively, as part of a community of care providers or a community of people with common aims. And in this case, those kinds of efforts can be really, really powerful in supporting our continued work. Thank you all.
Thanks, Dan. And just one last thought from myself is just something to conclude on that I think dovetails well with the amazing work that is done through the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and the network across the country, is that sometimes palliative care and palliative approaches to care can be seen as sort of like a bells and whistles, kind of like on top of everything. But actually, it's through the stories that we've seen in our experiences in caring for people experiencing homelessness. We've seen the downstream effects of a lack of housing, lack of income, and lack of social supports. And those stories, those narratives that we've experienced speak to the many upstream policies that we need to be working on collectively, like housing as a human right. And so we hope that we see this work as important work to ending homelessness on a continuum. And I do want to thank the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, Tim, Debbie, and the entire team for their support and having us today. It was a real pleasure. And thanks to this amazing team I get to work with every day. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hayden. Thank you to our all-star panel. That was a really terrific, very comprehensive, very thoughtful presentation that I know is going to be very useful, very helpful to the folks that have joined us and those that will watch the recording. Just want to let everybody know that we'll be posting a recording of this webinar and all the information that was mentioned on cnh3.ca/resources. We'll send you a link to that following the webinar once it's all sorted out and ready. In terms of, I'm glad you brought up advocacy. We are going to be launching a nationwide advocacy campaign called Recovery for All. I am expecting that'll get organized and launched next week after the Victoria Day weekend. We're just putting it all together now. And more information will be available to everybody, and a way for you to participate and be part of a movement that is working together to end homelessness. And I will just wrap by thanking everyone who joined us for the call, not just for joining us for the call, but for the work that you're doing. We certainly appreciate how hard that work is and how challenging it is these days. And I've said to a number of people that I feared at the very beginning of this pandemic that there was going to be a catastrophic loss of life among our homeless neighbors. I think there's certainly been difficulty, certainly been suffering, but we haven't seen outbreaks of the scale that we had feared. Certainly outbreaks, certainly challenges and people being hurt, but the fact that we haven't seen catastrophic death from COVID-19 in the shelter system is due to all of your work. So thank you all very much, and please do take care of yourselves. Thank you. We'll see you all soon.